Have you ever noticed how people argue about communism versus socialism with absolute confidence and absolutely no idea what they're talking about? It's wild. Entire governments mix them up. Political leaders throw these words around like emotional grenades. And maybe, just maybe, you've been caught in the crossfire without even realizing it. Today, we're cutting through decades of confusion, fear, and propaganda. And I'll warn you now, some of what you're about to hear goes against everything you were taught. But once you understand the real difference between communism and socialism, you'll start seeing political debates with brand new eyes. And trust me, the payoff is immediate. So if you're tired of misinformation, tired of slogans pretending to be truth, and ready to understand how these ideas actually shape modern life, stay with me until the end. This video might change the way you think about economics, power, and even human nature. Before we dive in, hit the like button and subscribe to support the channel. It helps more than you can imagine, and it keeps us creating videos like this for you.
Why we confuse communism and socialism, the origin of the mix-up.
Most people throw around communism versus socialism as if they're the same thing, like two names for the same blurry political ideology. But they're not twins. They're distant cousins who grew up in different neighborhoods and barely talk to each other. The confusion started because political leaders, especially during the Cold War, used both terms interchangeably to rally public opinion. When a government wants to create a villain, precision suddenly becomes optional. That's why even today, in the middle of modern debates about economic systems and class struggle, people still mix them up without realizing how different they truly are. Back then, newspapers, politicians, and propaganda machines were less concerned about accuracy and more about emotional impact. If you slap communist on something, you could instantly trigger fear. If you called an opponent socialist, you could paint them as anti-capitalist without even explaining what that meant. Over time, this ambiguity became convenient, especially for leaders who wanted to frame all collective ownership ideas as one giant threat. This is why the difference between communism and socialism became more of a political weapon than a philosophical distinction. Another issue is language itself. Words evolve. What started as academic terms in Marxist theory slowly turned into cultural labels. In everyday speech, socialism became a soft insult in some countries and a badge of progress in others. Communism, on the other hand, turned into a catch-all phrase for anything involving state control, even when the theory actually argues for a stateless society. No wonder people are lost. Half the time, governments themselves don't use the terms correctly. So before diving into the real difference between communism and socialism, it helps to understand the historical fog that covers both concepts. And once you wipe that fog away, something surprising emerges. The original thinkers behind these ideas had clear intentions, and they didn't always agree. And that's exactly where we're heading next. Because to understand the present confusion, we need to go back to the source.
Marx's foundation, what he actually meant by communism and socialism.
Karl Marx never imagined his ideas would be turned into national slogans, party names, or economic systems enforced by tanks. His original theory was more nuanced and honestly more idealistic than what most governments ended up doing. In Marx's theory, socialism was the transitional phase where the working class would take control of the economy, while communism was the final stage, a classless, stateless society where people contribute based on ability and receive based on need. When you look at it this way, communism versus socialism isn't a debate, it's a sequence. Marx believed that capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction, mainly through exploitation, inequality, and constant class struggle. He wasn't shy about criticizing wage labor or the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. But his solution wasn't instant communism. Instead, the first step was socialism, collective ownership under a workers' government, still using a planned economy and transitional structures. Only after society outgrew greed, competition, and the need for a state would communism emerge. The big misunderstanding? Marx never said socialism meant government owning everything as we see in some modern interpretations. His focus was on who had power over production, the workers or the capitalists. He imagined socialism as a bridge, a necessary but temporary stage. Communism, in his eyes, wasn't a government system at all. It was the end of all governments. Ironically, the countries that claimed to be communist became some of the most powerful states in history. Understanding Marx's original idea helps us see why so many modern debates miss the point. People argue about political ideology without noticing that Marx considered communism a distant horizon, not a policy platform. And if that sounds abstract, don't worry. We're about to bring things down to earth by looking at something most people care about far more. Who actually owns what?
Ownership and control. Who owns what in each system?
If you want to understand the difference between communism and socialism in real-world terms, forget the slogans and look at ownership. In capitalism, individuals or corporations own the means of production. In socialism, the workers, through cooperatives, councils, or the state, own or control them. In communism, ownership disappears entirely because everything is shared. Sounds simple, but once power enters the equation, things get messy. Many political leaders use collective ownership as a justification for expanding state power rather than empowering workers. Socialism allows variations. Worker cooperatives, public services, mixed economies, and systems where private enterprise still exists but with stronger safety nets. That's why many European countries adopt social democratic policies without abandoning capitalism. Communism, on the other hand, imagines a world where private property no longer exists. Not your house or personal belongings, but large-scale productive assets like factories, land, and infrastructure. It's the ultimate expression of collective ownership. However, the tricky part is control. You can have a system where the state owns everything in the name of the people, but the people themselves have little say. This gap between theory and implementation is why many countries claiming to be socialist or communist end up functioning very differently from Marx's ideas. When leaders centralize authority, even well-intentioned economic systems can turn into rigid bureaucracies. Once you see how ownership and control shape societies, it becomes obvious why ideologies diverge so sharply. And that leads us to the next layer: how these systems think real change happens, and what role the state plays along the way.
Freedom, power, and the state. Reform versus revolution.
Communism versus socialism often comes down to one essential question: how should society change? Socialists tend to believe in reform, using democracy, laws, and gradual policy shifts to reduce inequality. Communists argue that capitalism is so deeply structured around exploitation that only a revolution can break the cycle. This difference in strategy influences everything else: attitudes toward the state, political ideology, and even how people view human nature. Socialists usually accept the state as a tool, imperfect but useful. They believe governments can regulate markets, protect workers, and expand social programs without dismantling the entire system. Communists, however, see the state as a temporary but necessary instrument of class struggle. Once socialism stabilizes, the state is supposed to slowly dissolve as society becomes more equal. The irony? In practice, states got bigger, not smaller. This tension between reform and revolution also explains why many socialist movements distance themselves from communist ones, even if they share criticism of capitalism. Reformists worry that revolutionary methods lead to authoritarianism, while revolutionaries claim reform only strengthens the existing system. It's an old debate, and one that still shapes modern political ideology and economic systems today. And just when you think theory is confusing, history steps in with an even bigger twist. Because the moment these ideas were tested in the real world, the gap between ideology and reality became impossible to ignore.
Human nature and motivation, where both ideologies clash with reality.
Every political ideology sounds clean and perfect on paper until you introduce actual humans into the equation. Humans have desires, egos, fears, ambitions, and biases. And that's where both communism and socialism meet their biggest challenge: motivation. How do you maintain productivity in a planned economy? How do you prevent corruption when the state has too much power? How do you ensure fairness when people contribute differently? Human nature complicates the most elegant theories. Communism imagines a world where everyone contributes out of pure social commitment. No competition, no greed, no hierarchy. Beautiful idea. But humans are wired for incentives, status, and personal goals. Socialism tries to balance this by mixing collective responsibility with individual motivation. You still have workers' rights, safety nets, and collective ownership, but people are allowed to pursue their ambitions. This hybrid approach tends to align better with human behavior. Still, both systems face the same threat: concentrated power. When one group, whether capitalists, party leaders, or bureaucrats, gains too much control, inequality grows. And that's why some socialist countries thrive while others struggle. Culture, accountability, and transparency matter just as much as ideology. It's not enough to design a system. You need humans who can operate it without sabotaging the very values it's built on. And once you bring human behavior into the conversation, you can't avoid talking about what actually happened when societies tried these systems. Because theory is a promise, but history is the receipt. And that brings us to one of the most revealing parts of the journey.
Real-world experiments. What history taught us.
When you compare communism versus socialism in the real world, history becomes the ultimate teacher. The Soviet Union tried to implement Marxist ideas at industrial scale, but ended up creating a highly centralized state that often contradicted Marx's own writings. On paper, it aimed for equality and collective ownership. In practice, scarcity, bureaucracy, and political repression took over. Millions admired its promise. Millions more suffered under its reality. The gap between ideology and implementation became impossible to ignore. China followed a different path. After initial attempts at pure communism led to disaster, the country pivoted, mixing market incentives with authoritarian governance. Today, it operates a hybrid model: capitalist-style growth under a communist party. It's a living contradiction, but one that transformed a poor agrarian country into a global economic powerhouse. China shows that when ideology meets pragmatism, new economic systems can emerge that don't fit into neat categories. Then there are the Nordic countries, often mislabeled as socialist. In reality, they're capitalist economies with strong social democratic policies. They use high taxes to fund universal health care, education, and public services, while still encouraging free markets, private ownership, and entrepreneurship. These nations demonstrate that socialism doesn't have to replace capitalism. It can refine it. They're not examples of communism or socialism, but of balance. And finally, places like Cuba and North Korea show the darker side of revolutionary attempts. Idealism met isolation, resource shortages, and rigid political control. Their economies struggled, and their citizens pay the price. When you look at all these examples together, one message becomes clear: the labels matter far less than how power is distributed and how incentives are structured. And that insight leads us to a fascinating question. Why, even after all this history, do people still cling so passionately to one side?
Why the debate still matters. Inequality, technology, and modern capitalism.
Even with decades of historical experiments behind us, the debate around communism versus socialism refuses to die. Why? Because the problems they tried to solve are still here. Inequality, concentration of wealth, power imbalances, and exploitation didn't disappear with the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, in today's digital economy, these issues have taken new forms. Tech billionaires accumulate wealth faster than nations, and workers' rights struggle to keep up with automation. Socialism re-enters the conversation every time people feel left behind, whether in rising housing costs, medical debt, or stagnant wages. Meanwhile, capitalism defenders point to innovation, opportunity, and personal freedom. The tension mirrors the old debates: reform versus revolution, security versus risk, collective good versus individual choice. Modern political ideology still echoes the arguments that Marx ignited over a century ago. But technology complicates everything. AI, digital surveillance, and algorithmic management blur the lines between freedom and control. Some argue that tech giants have created a new kind of digital feudalism. Others believe technology will empower workers like never before. In this landscape, both socialist and communist ideas are being reinterpreted to address problems Marx could never have imagined. And if the world is changing this fast, then the psychological pull of these ideologies becomes even more interesting. Because beyond the economics, something deeper is at play, something rooted in identity, hope, and fear.
The hidden psychological appeal. Why people still choose sides.
At the heart of every political ideology is a story about who we are and what we deserve. Communism promises perfect equality and a world free of class struggle. Socialism offers fairness, dignity, and protection from the sharp edges of capitalism. Capitalism, in turn, promises freedom, opportunity, and self-determination. The debate persists because each worldview speaks to a different part of human nature. People don't just choose ideologies, they choose identities. The appeal of socialism often comes from a desire for compassion and stability. The appeal of communism comes from a longing for justice and radical transformation. The appeal of capitalism comes from ambition and the dream of upward mobility. None of these desires are purely rational, they're emotional. They reflect our fears, our upbringing, and our environment. That's why two people can look at the same economic system and see entirely different realities. This psychological dimension is why debates become so heated. People defend their ideology like they defend their family name. When someone questions socialism or capitalism, it feels personal. It pokes at our deepest beliefs about fairness, effort, and what we owe each other. Understanding this emotional layer helps us see why logical arguments alone rarely change minds. And once we reach this point, one thing becomes clear. The debate is far bigger than economics or history. It's about human beings trying to find meaning in a chaotic world. And that brings us to the end of the journey, or rather, to the beginning of something even more important.
The choice we all make without noticing.
At the end of the day, the debate over communism versus socialism isn't really about economic systems. It's about the kind of world we believe we deserve. And now that you understand how these ideologies evolved, how they collided with human nature, and how history reshaped them, the next step is yours. The real question is, which values guide your choices? Equality? Freedom? Stability? Opportunity? Or a balance that feels uniquely your own? Because whether you realize it or not, every time you vote, work, consume, or speak up, you're shaping the economic system around you. You don't need to be a theorist to influence society. You just need clarity. And that's what this journey was about. Seeing through the noise so you can think for yourself. No slogans, no fear, just understanding. So here's my challenge to you. Take one idea from this video, just one, and apply it in your next conversation about politics or economics. Notice how differently you respond now that the confusion is gone. Notice how much sharper your thinking feels. And ask yourself, what kind of society am I really supporting with my choices? If this video helped you see things more clearly, do your part to keep this channel alive. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling us which insight hit you the hardest. The more you engage, the more videos like this we can create together.